Thank you, Martina. Okay, for some people that may not be familiar with Teagasc, Teagasc was established in 1988, and essentially our remit is to provide research, advisory and education services right across the land-based sector. So at the moment we operate courses at level 5 and level 6 in agriculture, horticulture, equine and forestry, and we would also work with partner organisations such as a number of the IoTs with regard to delivery of level 7 and level 8 courses, again in agriculture and horticulture predominantly. So I suppose a very, very common question we often get: does a farmer need a qualification? So does a person who wants to farm need a qualification in terms of RPL? Essentially the answer is no, they don't. However, if they do have a qualification, there's quite a lot of incentives and benefits out there for them. So essentially for a young person going into the agricultural sector at the moment, if they do acquire a course that is approved by Revenue or the Department of Agriculture, they deem a status called Young Trained Farmer status. And with that, that brings quite a lot of benefits at a local level for that particular person. And I suppose one of the significant drivers for Teagasc is the changes with regard to policy. And at EU level, I suppose one of the most significant ones is CAP reform that's coming into play. And as Martina mentioned, at the moment we're looking at post-2020. So the RDP programme came into play in 2015 and was funded until 2019. And within that programme, the benefits to young farmers have been quite significant. So a young farmer scheme was launched in 2015 with a budget of 24 million per year. So a young farmer could come into the scheme in 2015 and continue in it for a 5-year period. It was very, very significant, and what it meant is that it provided funding for a young person to be installed or to be established in their own right on the farm. And I suppose the benefits of that for a young person is it gives them an identity. Transfer of land and transfer of property in Ireland is very slow for a number of reasons. So both Revenue and Department have put incentives in place. For example, in terms of Revenue, they have tax incentives. So if a person is under 35, there's incentives there if a farm is transferred to them. In the case of the department, they have an installation. Historically, they had an installation aid scheme, and now we call it a young farmer scheme. Now, one of the drivers, I suppose, for Teagasc in terms of providing education is that when that scheme was launched in 2015, there were over 10,000 applications to the department for that particular scheme. And I suppose one of the repercussions of that is that training all persons coming into the scheme had to have a minimum of a level 6 qualification in agriculture or equivalent. So I suppose we talk about agriculture, equine, forestry and horticulture under the same umbrella, but alternatively people could have had qualifications right across farm management, sustainability, so a number of varying qualifications. One of the roles for Teagasc under our remit is to look at qualifications in terms of equivalence to approved qualifications. So, for example, a typical scenario might be where somebody has done some agricultural elements in a course, for example, an environmental science course, but they're coming into an agriculture course because their intention is to actually farm long term. So for those people, the role, I suppose, of RPL is very, very significant, and it can bring a lot of benefits for them in terms of what they can get out of the course. A further driver is obviously the EU CDFOP guidelines from a Teagasc point of view to implement them in our RPL policy, and obviously as a provider of QQI programmes at level 5 and level 6 our adherence to those policies. But in 2018 we undertook a strategic vision project as well. I suppose things are changing in agriculture. Milk quotas have been removed from farms, so there's no longer a limit on a dairy farm, for example, with regard to how much milk can be supplied, or I suppose it traditionally came down to the number of cows a farmer could have. So and obviously the implications of Brexit. So there was a lot of changes in the sector, and obviously within the both agricultural sector and education sector as well. So in 2018 we launched our strategic vision document, and within that our objective was to look at how we could meet the future needs of our students and of our learners. So one of the goals essentially that we're trying to meet at the moment is to establish professional development routes for farmers and the wider land sector, including an alumni support programme for Teagasc graduates who are taking up farming. So what we recognised through that particular study and our time with focus groups with stakeholders is that although we're training a cohort of farmers, when people leave those training programmes, there's still a demand for farm management and farm planning as well, because oftentimes when a person does an agricultural training programme, they're quite young, they're in their 20s. However, the transfer of land may not come until a later stage. So from the point of view of RPL, we need, I suppose, to work on that particular area. A further goal within that particular vision project was that we would adapt innovative teaching and learning methodologies for the delivery of our teaching methodologies and learner supports, and within that obviously looking at our RPL methods. With regard to RPL, as it stands at the moment, I suppose core to this particular process is our student, and I suppose what Leva mentioned earlier is that are all our students aware that RPL is available to them? So whether they're an adult learner or whether they're a 17, 18-year-old school leaver, do they know that they can apply for RPL to us? So I suppose in our documentation we're very conscious of that. We pull that then obviously into our policy and processes, and then obviously we're focused on the outcome at the end of the day, and the level of satisfaction of both the learner and the staff that provide our RPL adjudications for us as well. So we're constantly, I suppose, feeding that back into the process. Our RPL policy, we would see it very much as a working document. So what we try to do is we evaluate it based on feedback, and we, as I said to you there earlier, we're very, very conscious that it needs to change on an ongoing basis depending upon demand. We have a centralised RPL process. It mainly works out of our curriculum development unit, and then we use panels of teaching staff and practitioners across all our colleges and our regional centres as well. With regard to future plans, and this is the last slide, Anne, so, with regard to how we're managing and I suppose planning for the future, there will be increased focus on skills gained from farming. It is a particular unique sector that a lot of people acquire their skills for farming from a parent, and when we look at the demographic, there is a high proportion of those parents that haven't undergone formal training. So it's something within our RPL process that we recognise the skills that people are coming into at point of entry in the course. However, in terms of best practice for animal welfare, for I suppose sustainability of the farm, financial management, we do have to, I suppose, get the balance right in terms of recognition and ensuring that the person is future-proofed to perform and to be able to run the farm in a viable manner going into the future in accordance with the Department of Agriculture and EU legislation. Reform of the CAP 2020, we'll see a new CAP being rolled out. At the moment, we can see that sustainability of farms, environmental issues are going to be key, as well as food assurance, food safety and animal health and welfare. So we know at this stage they'll obviously have a big impact on training programmes. A CPD model for farmers as well is going to be key for us, and as I mentioned already, how we recognise the skills that farmers are coming into the courses with at that stage. So thank you for your time.